Welcome to Node Nerds. We're so glad that you're joining us today. We are going to talk about the dreaded stitch in the ditch. And I say dreaded because it does take longer. If you're a paying customer, it's going to cost you more, and there's a reason for that. And sometimes we're not really comfortable with how we should do it, where the needle is supposed to hit in the seam, or to the right of the seam, or the left of the seam, the up seam, the down seam. There's just so many questions, right? Which thread do I use? Should I bury my threads? There's lots of questions surrounding stitch in the ditch. So today, that's what we're going to talk about. Ava, as a hand guider, I bet you do a lot of stitch in the ditch.
I do.
And why
Um,
do you like stitch in the ditch so much?
I love Stitch in the Ditch. Well, and one thing to consider, I quilt for others, and I'm in Ohio, and I do get predominantly custom quilts. And my customers, because they're often traditional quilters, they want it to be done just so, which includes stitch in the ditch. I'm a big fan because it really emphasizes the piecing. It makes it look finished. I also am a big fan of seeing what's happening on the front of the quilt, on the back of the quilt, where it's a reflection, or mirror image, whatever wording you want to use, on the back of the quilt. But the main reason is that it looks finished. And I think we're going to see some examples as to what the different looks are.
Anybody else stitch in the ditch?
I do.
I do.
Okay. Tell us about
Um,
why you like stitch in the ditch or don't.
I'm very much like Ava as well. For me, I just like the back to look just as nice and finished as the front. And when I'm doing my custom work, I do a lot of fills. And so if I'm traveling within that block with a fill, if I haven't stitched in the ditch, to me it looks unfinished, right? You've got blank spaces, and so I particularly like to do it, especially if I know I'm working with fills and trims and things like that. But again, like you said, it's a cost thing. So I do it for all my custom, but that's one of the first things that we can discuss with customers if the price for custom is too high because it takes so long. Are you comfortable with, that look on the back? Or do you want it to be finished? Is it being judged where it needs to be finished looking versus is this just for you or a gift and the person won't notice? So it's
But a
dependent.
good point to bring up with what Angela was saying. I'm curious because Vida mentioned that I come from the hand-guided background and I don't use my Statler Ascent for the stitch in the ditch work. And because I've been quilting 20 years or close to it, I do the ditch work, I find, very quickly. I have my ruler base plate on and I use my ruler just to guide me where that ditch is. And I can do it pretty darn quick. Whereas if I use my Statler, um, it, it's much, much slower. So when my customers want a quote for a quilting project that includes in this, the ditch work, probably it's going to be not as bad than if I was to, use the Statler. So
Mm,
that's something to consider as well, you
yeah,
know.
yeah.
absolutely.
That's
Yeah.
interesting. I personally don't stitch in the ditch almost ever. One, because my clientele want a fast, cheap edge to edge. That's what I have in my area. Um, but also I bought a Statler for the precision and the speed. And I can't do that with stitch in the ditch because I haven't taken the time to practice because I'm one of those that well, I want it done. I want it done now. I want the quick results. So it's the time for me because I haven't taken the time like Ava to practice or had to do it. that it's not in my ballpark. It's not in my wheelhouse. I don't want to do it unless I feel it necessary, which some quilts really do need it.
You know, and it does come down to personal preference. We all have different levels of acceptance, maybe, because to me, and I'm sure you all feel the same way, that you want to give your customer the best outcome. You know, we take pride in that. And for me, that includes stitch in the ditch because I feel that that's for me, you know, the complete thing, you know, where every piece is outlined, you know, and enclosed with the ditch work. So, you know, I mean, we probably could talk about this ad nauseum and never agree, but that's why we have different, you know, levels of acceptance. That doesn't mean that I think Kayla is a horrible quilter because she doesn't feel that way. You know, it's truly how, you know, what we perceive to be our best work.
To add on to what Kayla said, for the longest time, I didn't stitch in the ditch because I was not good at it. And I don't know, a couple of years ago, I was like, this is silly. Some of these quilts need to be ditched. Like you can tell. And especially as I started doing more and more and more custom. So I took a long time to figure out which way was better for me. I practiced with draw a line and surfing. And like Ava said, that takes a long time. And I'm not so good at surfing. And I'm not so good at getting that. It just didn't work for me. And so then I said, okay, let's put the ruler plate on, drop the belts, use ruler. And the more I did that, the more I realized, okay, I'm more efficient if I drop the belt and use a ruler plate and a ruler. This is faster for me. It's easier for me. I can hit it in the ditch better. And so I started doing it that way. It took me a while to figure out which way I was better at. Like I would do a quilt and do a little bit of each on the same quilt. And then once I figured that out and started using it with just the ruler, now I really like ditch work. Like I didn't like it before, but now I like it and it's fun. And I don't know, love to drop the belt and just choo.
You know, it's one thing if you're ditching around the border, but if you have, you know, intricately pieced blocks, you know, and then they're not always perfectly pieced. So it's a lot more forgiving if you drop your belts. I find it's less stressful for me to watch over it, hover over it, and serve. You know, I've tried it. I really wanted to give it my best shot, and it works. It works well, but the time involved in it, no.
Yeah. Yeah.
So those are all really, really good points. I started out trying to do it as draw a line with my Statler, and I was frustrated too, just like Kat, like it wasn't landing where I wanted it to land. And so some things that you can do if you're struggling with that too is, first of all, make sure that you're sighting in that laser. Make sure that you're adjusting it. Use the tape method with a little bit of painter's tape to make sure that you know exactly where that needle is going to hit when it stitches, and in comparison to where your laser is lined up, because sometimes that's the problem, right? Another thing that you can do that makes it a bit more forgiving is change the thread that you're using. Many long arm quilters prefer to use micro quilter thread, which is a 100 weight thread. It's very fine and it disappears into that ditch. You know, so if you use a heavier thread, whatever you're using on the quilt, it's going to show up more. So any little wobbles or imperfections are going to be more noticeable. Some of the other benefits, not just as far as how the quilt looks, is that it stabilizes everything. If you stitch in the ditch, you're stabilizing all that piecing of the quilt, and it makes it easier to drop your patterns in. So when I am working, especially with Judy Niemeyer quilts, I do a combination of both. Some areas are just easier, faster to drop the belts, put the ruler plate on, and use a ruler because I can move the ruler and get through that section faster, especially if they're small sections. If they're larger sections, I prefer to use draw line. And then usually what I'll do is I'll do all of the the stitch in the ditch, and then in the quiltable area that I have, and then I go in and drop my patterns. Now the trick is I can't use, right, because of shrinkage, I can't use those boundaries. I can't just convert those to a boundary. It would be beautiful if I could. I could do that if I did them one at a time. Draw a line, stitch it, drop the pattern, because then I could kind of adjust and double check using, my crosshairs and that sort of thing. And sometimes I will do that. But typically I'm switching between each of those. And I like it because it does stabilize everything, but not everybody wants to pay for that. Some quilters will charge by the hour to do that. I have found that a lot of customers, they can't grasp time, so it makes them afraid to ask for it. So I price it into my by the square inch pricing. I have a no stitch in the ditch or light stitch in the ditch and heavy stitch in the ditch price for my Judy Niemeyer quilts especially. I'm going to share my screen for a second, and we're going to take a look at a couple of quilts. They're both Judy Niemeyer quilts. One, the customer did not want stitch in the ditch. And the other one is my personal quilt, which of course I did stitch in the ditch, so that you can kind of see the difference between the two. Okay, so here's an example of no stitch in the ditch. Now, to be fair, it's a beautiful quilt and it turned out really nice. And I made sure that as I placed the patterns, that I brought them all the way out to the edge that I could, right, without getting into other areas. And it turned out beautiful. She's going to be perfectly happy with it. This is what she wanted. Okay. So that's one with no stitch in the ditch. And then let's take a look at one where everything got stitch in the ditch. And this one, because we did stitch in the ditch on it, we get a lot more loft in our different areas, and there's more definition to the piecing, the overall piecing of the quilt, which I feel like sometimes you in the pink, like the hot pink areas, Angela was mentioning earlier in another episode that how those popped up. I didn't do any quilting on that at all other than the stitch in the ditch. So sometimes stitch in the ditch is all you need.
But you didn't ditch everything. I'm sorry. You didn't ditch everything though, because on the my right hand side where the spiky things are, those teal spikes.
Yes, so I didn't do everything on this one. You're right. I did not stitch. I did not stitch.
Definitely see, not that I'm criticizing. I just really, if I'm looking at that versus the points, on otherwise, you see the difference, because it looks to me like you didn't go down the ditch where that magenta and the teal spike is in the center.
I did not.
And so what happens, and again, don't take this the wrong way at all. This is such a good visual, because it didn't define where those two colors come together. And it makes that whole thing definitely, because I think you mentioned you used 3 layers of batting.
I had 2 layers of batting and one was wool. So what I wanted to happen there is I wanted that to puff a little bit more. And if I had stitched in the ditch, it would have pushed it down more. And that's not what I wanted. So, but all of this is personal preference, right?
It is. And it all depends too, because he used a rather large design around those spikes. And that's where it didn't pop out then as much as if you had used a smaller scale design around those spikes. And that's really important to remember when we, make our design choices, the scale of the different designs and how they come together.
Sure.
So hang on. I wanted to mention, Evita, you briefly touched on it, but how, like in the fuchsia, the hot pink ones, that all you did was stitch around it and they pop. And yes, those right there. That's something that I do as well. If I have like a really, really, really thin sashing, I'll just stitch on both sides of it and it pops and it looks awesome, just like that does. And that's all the quilting you need. So in that case, I save time just by ditching it because I'm not having to trace out a boundary and fit a pattern in there. And it looks amazing.
And another thing to also, like, this is my quilt, right, Ava?
Yeah.
So if I changed my mind after I got it done, I could put it back on my frame and I could add ditch work where in those places, right? We don't have that option with our clients' quilts once they leave us, but sometimes you get to the end of the quilt, especially with a custom quilt, and you might go back through and areas that you thought don't need the stitch in the ditch, you change your mind as you're going back through and you add stitch in the ditch.
It's always when you're at that last part of it, like 3/4 of the way down, you go, oh, I should have done this. Always then, not from the top.
That's the nice thing about stitch in the ditch too, is it's not going to change the overall design that you've already put on there. But like Vita said, if you want to go back and just accentuate something different after, you can always add it after. It's really versatile that way to help highlight different pieces that maybe didn't quite pop as much as you had intended it to with the outside boundaries. So then you just go in and you add the stitch in the ditch.
And
Okay, I
see,
have a random
with this photo, this was not done. This was in process because you can see over in this area that I hadn't done the stitch in the ditch yet over here. So it's possible. I can't even remember now. There have been so many quilts between this one and now that I may have gone back in there, Ava, done that.
And was just the comments I made was based on the visual. Again, it wasn't criticism. It was, but that's the difference when we make a decision and what the effect of using it or not using it, but the consequences,
And
and again, like you said, it's truly about personal preference. I consider myself an over quilter. And I have a really hard time when somebody wants light custom. I do that. But then before I take it off the frame, I take the tension off of my rollers and let it just hang there. Then I walk away. Then I walk back and I'm thinking, it needs more. No, that's not what they want. So I do that several times and I have a really hard time. But when it comes to the ditch work, gotta go on there.
Well, and you can see even in this picture, as you're working and as you're doing things and dropping patterns and doing ditch work, things are happening to the rest of the quilt. Things are beginning to puff. And so you may have a plan, but then when you actually start executing it, you change your mind as you go along.
All
even
the time.
I'm not hand guiding this and I'm, doing it with the computer, you do change your mind. So
I have two questions for you, Vita.
Sure.
First question, I see you have the micro handles. When you ditch with a ruler, do you use the micro handles or the regular ones? I'm just curious.
I use the micro handles and I only drop the one on the right.
Okay. I do the one on the left. I'm left-handed. I don't have micro handles, but when I use handles. My next question is this your regular Statler or is this your Ascend, or had you not upgraded yet at that point?
At this point, it had not been upgraded.
Okay.
This was the Statler when it was still living in the house.
Oh, sure. I didn't even notice that it's not the studio.
I wanted to mention too, sometimes the quilt will dictate whether or not you want to stitch in the ditch.
Oh yeah.
I've gotten I think it's called the Lone Star with all the diamond points, and there's tons of bulky seams that can occur if they're not pressed or opened or for customers. And in that case, it would have been a detriment to try and get over all those bulky seams. So then I just would come in, an 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 of an inch inside instead.
Then draw art can be your friend if you're doing something like that Lone Star for sure.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
the other thing too is talking about stitching in the ditch. There for a while, it was this fad that everybody in their patterns that designed patterns, quilt patterns, would instruct the quilters to press all their seams open. And in some instances, it's warranted, like a Lone Star maybe. However, you know, then the customer comes and wants you to do ditch work. And I tell them it's going to look sloppy
Mhm.
because there is no defined ditch if the seams are pressed open. There is no up or down, it's flat. And so that's another point as to when you should not be doing stitch in the ditch, period.
I was always taught, Eva, I don't know if you guys heard this too, that the other problem with doing that when the seams are pressed open is that then you've just got thread on thread. So
Mm-hmm.
there's nothing there to really secure the quilting after. So it not only looks sloppy, but it's not secure. Like
Yeah.
you run the risk of, breaking either.
I'm going to be devil's advocate here. I agree with everything you said. I personally like to press my seams open. So in this case, like looking at Vita's quilt as an example, what I would do is instead of stitching right in the ditch, like I'm looking at the white fabric next to the purple fabric.
Yep.
So what I would do is I'd use my white thread and I would stitch in the ditch, but I would do it right on the white side. That way, I'm being very careful that none of the white gets onto the purple, and then I'm not in the seam, like you said, it's not thread on thread, but I'm still ditching it and I still get that loft and that look. So
Yes.
that's just me. You do you. That's what I like.
Theoretically, you're not ditching it because
Very,
it's
very, as close as I can get to the edge
right.
without being in the ditch. Yes. But I
Yeah.
still consider that ditch work because, it's done the same way.
Yeah.
It's just not exactly in the actual ditch for that reason.
So now that you mentioned that, let's take a look at what that actually looks like. Because we get that question a lot. Like, where should it be stitching when I'm doing the stitch in the ditch? So we recently made a new video. And so I did some recordings. Where is it? And so this is what this is where we want it to be hitting. Let me mute it because I'm sure there was a TV going in the background. This is where this is what we mean by stitch in the ditch. You're just really right on that edge. And you can see that because I'm using a micro quilter thread, it just disappears. And while you may still see it while you're stitching it or right after you stitched it, when it gets washed, when it gets fluffed, it really is going to disappear in there.
I don't know what your stitches per inch are, but one of the things too, that if I do a ton of ditch work and I do it first, I go to 16 stitches per inch. I don't know what you chose there. They look bigger than that. And that also helps with getting it right in the ditch. Plus with the micro quilter, of course.
Well, if you pay really close attention, this quilt is actually the quilt where the customer didn't want the stitch in the ditch. And so I only stitched that one little bit for the video. And then I pulled them out because I didn't have another one.
You ripped it out. Oh my gosh. You're dedicated. Way to go.
So just, you notice I only did a little tiny section.
So you definitely don't want your stitches per inch at 16 if you know that you're gonna have to rip
No,
it.
so
no, not if you're ripping it.
So I agree with Ava. When I actually do stitch in the ditch, I increase my stitches per inch so that they really can disappear. But I did not want to pull out those tiny stitches.
That's funny.
But another thing too, and this is going back to what Angela said earlier. She said she does her ditch work to complete when she does areas of fill or trim. And there are times, and it depends what type of thread, what weight of thread you use, that I will do my ditch work after I do my fill. for the simple fact that if it's a dense fill and I have done the ditch work first, it can pull out your ditch work and it no longer looks crisp. Because of the density of the fill, it will pull away from the ditch, and then that ditch thread is exposed. So, but I think what Angela too was referring to when she uses fill, the way fill travels, that it doesn't hit each one of those boundary lines. So there's gaps. And to me, there's nothing more unsightly than if that is not a complete line. So in that case, I for sure would do the ditch work after, because then it's one continuous stitching line over top of that segmented stitching line. So there's, we have to use our brains all the time, obviously. But, when we do the quilting, we have to figure out, you know, before we do something, yeah, generally you want to do your ditch work first, as Rita mentioned before, because then you can roll back and forth, and you have more freedom as you quilt the quilt, whether you start in the center or you start at the top of the quilt. But there are exceptions, and it's important for us to think of that, because we don't want to pull out or, stitch again. It's a huge topic, and there's no right or wrong, I think. It's what we're comfortable with, whether we use our statler or use a ruler.
Yep.
It's personal
Definitely.
preference.
Definitely personal preference.
Just have to find what you're most comfortable with if you're going to do it. And just like anything else, you can't be an expert until you're willing to fail.
Yep.
Because I can show you the early ones. I was like, "Ooh, I'm never going to like this." Now I don't mind. It just takes practice. And the more that you do it, the more comfortable you'll get and the faster you'll get. And then it won't seem so daunting to you. And like we've been saying, it is personal preference. Not every client is going to want you to do that, and pay for it. And so, you just have to smile and do what they want you to do, and do the best that you can if they don't want to have the stitch in the ditch on their quilt. So
it's a time thing too. Like Kayla had mentioned earlier, some people just need their quilts back faster and right away, in which case with edge to edge, you're not going to ditch. There's no need to. So
yeah. All right. Well, I hope that this answered some of everybody's questions about stitch in the ditch. How do we do it? What's the best way? It really is personal preference, not just for you as the long arm quilter, but for your customers and what they want to pay for. And we will see you back here on Node Nerds pretty soon.
Bye.
Bye.